Okay, so in the last video we had just finished setting up our card data so that we can easily create and add new cards. If you haven't seen that video, go and watch it now. And in this video we will be creating a new card from scratch. Now, to keep this clean, I will make a new data table for this. Instead of continuing to add new cards to the cards data table with all the included default cards in the toolkit, we'll be creating a new data table to keep our own added cards separate. You can add your own stuff here too as well, but to keep things tidy, we'll create a new one. So this would be creating a new miscellaneous and a data table, and we'll find the F card struct, and then we'll call this dt my cards. And then we have a new data table. And we could go in and copy one of these and then paste it here and use this as a starting point. And for a lot of the cards I create, there will often be a card which is similar, which I can use as a starting point. But now, for educational purposes, we'll start from scratch. And sometimes maybe you'll do that if you're making an extremely different card anyway. So we're starting with this blank card here, which will have the values that are the defaults within F card. So all of the defaults that are in here, those are the ones that will show up when you add this new card to the data table. And we got to think about what this card is going to be. So what I'm thinking is creating still a relatively straightforward card here. We'll create a card which draws us a card and which gives us some strength. So that's a fairly simple card to set up, and which will also allow me to talk about a lot of the different things that we can modify within the card. So a card which draws you a card and gives you some strength, maybe this can be thought of as like a charge or something like that, right? You're getting more value in your hand and you're preparing for some great attack. But it's a bit risky, right? Because you're drawing a card and you don't know what the card is going to be. So this could be called, let's say, heedless charge. And we'll give it the same name, just with a space. Not allowed to put spaces in the row name. So that will be our card. Now, already at this point, we can test this card out in our game. And we'll be doing that, and I'll be continuously doing that as we make changes here, so we can see how these changes actually affect the card. So we have this card here, and then we should add this to our deck. Now, in the last video, we added this smash card to our test deck. I'll keep that here, and then we'll add the new card, which is of course in our new data table. So we'll have to choose that. So that was my cards, and within here we can find our heedless charge card, and we'll save that and we'll hit play, and we should have a card, and here it is. So it has no portrait yet. It's called heedless charge. It has a mana cost of 0. If I use this, we're able to use this because we have 0 or more mana. And when we use it, it is discarded and nothing happens. So now we have a starting point, which is great. So we can go back to this as we keep changing the card. Right, so let's go back to our cards and we'll keep changing it. So for description, I'm not going to change this yet. It makes more sense to first define all of the stuff that our card is actually doing and then go back to create a description which best describes what we're doing. So we'll return to that. But we can add a portrait. So for this card, for Heedless Charge, I have found a portrait which is public domain I want to use, which is this one, Birkebeinerne, which was painted by Knut Bergslien, so a fellow Knut, though with a D, and a fellow Norwegian. So, and this looks like a fairly heedless charge. I realize now that this guy is carrying a child. So if you're carrying a child into battle, that's pretty heedless. So let's say that's fitting. And this should be under Birkebeinerne here, Birkebeiner. And there we have those. Now we can test this out quick. And we'll see that we have our portrait, which looks nice. Great. So back to my cards. Next we can add tooltips. And now tooltips would be things that show up on the side of the card when you hover over it to give you more information. We don't know exactly which ones we want yet, but I can show this now and we can return to this, but just to show how it works, we'll find the appropriate data table that holds tooltips. And so we have tooltips for artifacts and we have tooltips for statuses, and this is mostly where most of the tooltips we want to be using are, and we can just choose some random one here. So if I choose, say, the armor tooltip, and we hit play, and when we now hover over this card, you get the tooltip here on the side, as you can see. It shows up. And also the same, if we look in our deck and we hover over the card, you also have the tooltip. So we didn't want this card to apply any armor, so we'll be changing this later, but now you see how that works. So we can go into in another even more detailed video into how to change and add new tooltips. But for now, we're happy with this. Next, we want to have some tags to the cards. So tags, they can be all sorts of things, really. So this toolkit uses gameplay tags for all sorts of things. But one of the things it uses for is to identify different kinds of cards. Now we want to set the rarity of the card, and this is something that decides how often this card is going to show up in card rewards. And also the color of the gem that's at the top of the card frame. And we also want to set a type, like we want to define is this a skill card, a attack card, etc. This is something that might have no relevance in the particular game that you're making, of course, but you have that option of adding card types and card rarities. Or you can just ignore them if those are not needed. But let's change the rarities. We'll make this a rare card. And we'll also want to change the type of this card, which can be found here under effects, which is shared and also used for other types of gameplay use within the effects, but we'll get to that. But we will say that this is a skill card, so it's rare and it's a skill. And if we hit save and hit play, we will see now that we have this blue gem on the top for the rarity. And now it says that we have a skill card. So those are visual changes, but then when we add gameplay to other types of cards, we might reference, these types so that it affects cards in different ways. For instance, there is a card that's included, the shelter card, which when used grants you armor, but also discards all attack cards in your hand. So then it loops over all the cards in your hand. It looks for their type, and if they have the attack type, they will be discarded. So they can also then be used for gameplay and not just for visualizing. So that's it for the card tags. We can have lots of other stuff here, and when creating more complex cards later, we can play more around with this. Next is targeted. So this is what tells really the UI when you're dragging the card. If we want the targeting arrow to show up. So currently, we just draw the card up and no arrow appears. If we check targeted for this, then when we drag this card, we will get this targeting arrow. It won't be able to target anything yet because we haven't defined any valid targets, but we get this arrow here. Now for this card, we wanted to draw a card and grant strength to our hero here, so it doesn't have to be targeted since we just have the single hero, so we'll set targeting to false for this card. Okay, so next is the big one, that's card effects. So this is here actually most of the stuff that we're interested in with the card is going to happen. So card effects is an array of card effect objects, and the card effect objects, those are the objects that actually do stuff in the game. So you can have card effects that say that you want to draw a card, or a card effect that you want to add a status effect, a card effect that is responsible for attacking, etc. So card effects, that's generally what the card actually does, with some additions later on, but this is where you get the most important stuff. So here is where we want to define our effect for drawing a card, and for granting strength to our hero. So we will add an effect, and we can start, let's say, with the strength effect here. So here we have a lot of variables that we can play with. So first we need to find an effect class. So now I want to add strength to the hero, and we have to find the appropriate effect for this. And if you click this, you get access to all of the card effects that are included with the toolkit. You're very likely going to add more card effects of your own. And which effect do we want here? Well, for this we want to add a status. We want to add the strength status to our hero. And we will be going into like making your own effects later on, where you can see more about how the effects actually work. But for now, let's just keep this one as it is. If you want to see how it works, you can browse to this asset, and you can open it up, and you can see what it does when this resolves a card effect. So yeah, you can see this here. What it does is that it takes, the target from the card, and it applies a status to that target that we are targeting. And the status that it applies is defined in the target component, which is also defined in the data. And we'll go back to this. So we can see from this that for this to work, we're going to need a target, and we're going to need to define a target component, which needs to be a status, which will be applied to this target. And the target also has to be something that implements this interface here, which when we hover over, we can see is the BPI card target interface. And the minions, like the troll, they implement this interface. So, okay, with this in mind, we can go back to the data table. And we can see here, so we're adding a status. We want this to have a certain value. So we want to add our strength value. Let's say that we give our hero 5 strength. And then we have this target component, because we haven't actually told this status that we want to add strength yet. We want to add something, but we have to tell it there. And target component can be any component, so you get this huge list. But if we search for status, we will get our statuses here. And we can find the strength status that we want to add. Do we want to have any particular tags for this status? So you can add tags also to each effect, to each card effect, if you want to tell it to do any particular things. Whether these tags are used will be set up within resolve effects. But we can see that gameplay tags, gameplay tags here, they don't seem to be used for anything within this effect. So we don't need to change this. And targeting, so who is going to be targeted by this effect? And that's going to be our hero. And by default, the single player character that we're using, so in the initial release of this toolkit, you can only have one hero at a time, though you can summon units. More will be added in later updates, so you might be watching this when that is possible. But in any case, I've set it up so that each card has an owner, or they might have an owner. So the card is owned by a particular minion. By default, the hero, our warrior, owns all of the cards in our deck. Because of that, we can tell this to target the card owner. So that means that when we use this card, it's going to try to target whatever actor is owning the card. You can see that we have different kinds of targeting objects. So in the same way as the effect classes here, we can have lots of different components for defining our targeting behavior. But we'll use the card owner for this. We'll also be making our own targeting components in later videos. So we're targeting the owner, we're adding a status, we're adding the strength status, and we're adding it in a value of 5. So we can try this out now and see if it works. So if we drag this up, we can now see that when we drag this card up, our warrior is highlighted. So this indicates that this is who is going to be affected by our card. And when we drop it now, we see that we get a strength of 5. And from the strength tooltip, it tells us that it adds 5 damage to all attack cards. You can also see on our smites that now they do more damage than they did previously. Well, if you know that they usually do 9 damage, that is. So far so good. But you saw that there was no animation when we used the card, except for, the widget stuff. So maybe we want this warrior to do something. And we can also set this up in the effect. So we can define an effect action, and the effect action is a special kind of blueprint that defines any sort of visuals that we want to happen when the card effect is triggered. There's only one by default. It's set up you can choose the particular action so that you can create your own child actors of this blueprint to define your own behavior. But by default, we just have this one. And this effect action, it can take a particle effects and an animation as input. So this will cause the target to animate, or the owner of the card to animate. In this case, they're the same. And also we might spawn a particle. For now, for this, let's just have a animation. So we don't actually select a specific animation here, but we select a tag. So we have under the anim tags here the various kinds of animations that we can choose. And the animation blueprint takes these tags and translates this into an actual animation. So we can choose the cast animation for this. And if we now hit play, and we use this, you should see that this guy will play an animation, and he does. And you see that the strength effect appears at the appropriate time when he holds his arm up, and then the effect shows up. So this is defined in the action queue, which is covered in another video. Great, so that's the first card effect, but we also wanted to draw a card, so we can add a new effect. So we add it, and now we have another one. So for this, we want a new effect class, and we have one just for that, which is called draw. Again, we can take a look at this card effect and see what we actually need within this card effect. So here we have card effect draw, and we look at resolve card effect. Well, what do we need here? So we need to have an effect value, and it needs to be greater than 0. So the effect value here, what does it define? We can see that we are getting the card player, and we are looping over all of this effect value, and we're drawing a card. We're attempting to draw a card in the card hand, which is within the card player, for each value in the effect value. So effectively, this says draw this many cards on the hand component. So we're gonna need a effect value. So let's go back to my cards. So we will always need to define a target component. So for this, a targeting blueprint. So for this, we can say that we are targeting the card player. And then we want to draw, let's say that we want to draw 2 cards for this. And that's all we needed. We can add another animation so that we first have this animation, and then we have another animation in effect when we draw, but we can just also keep this blank so that we only have this one animation playing. So this should be enough that we get strength and we draw 2 cards. So let's try that out. There we get strength and we draw 2 cards. So the card is working exactly as we want it to, which is great. Let's see what more we can modify within the card. So one thing we see is that this one costs 0 mana, which is obviously way too little for a card like this, at least compared to the other cards that are included by default. Of course, the rules of your game might mean that that's a very sensible cost for the effect. Who am I to judge? But we can change this in the use rules. So you notice a pattern here. And this will be true for a lot of the toolkit, that many things are defined within data tables. So we define things like cards or like minions, etc. in data tables. And within these, we will often have these types of components that we are referencing, which are responsible for the actual behavior in game. So you have this other type of thing, which is called a use rule. So here we can add any number of use rules, which is a special type of object which is responsible for checking if a card can be used And also, when the card is used, do we have any sorts of costs that we're paying for using this card? So there are not many included by default, at least in the initial release, but you can easily add more different types of costs to your cards. So we can keep the value here of stat cost, since we want this card to cost a particular stat, and we'll keep this at mana. By default, all of the cards have a mana cost, or we have no other cost set up in the toolkit by default. We'll keep this used costs as mana, since this is really the only resource the player has by default. And we can change this to something else. Let's say 1. And then if we hit play, yeah, I forgot to hit save, but apparently that you don't need to, because it is saved. And now we see that we have a cost of a mana cost of 1. And you should see from the mana here, when we use this card, it is reduced. So that's working. And then also, after this, we don't have that much more to define. We have the post-use event. So this is an event that triggers after the card is used. So you could just add another effect for this. So what this tells the card here is, when the card is used, we want to discard it. You could just have added a separate effect for this. So you have a third effect which says, discard, and then discard this particular card. But you want to do that for almost every card. So I made this kind of simpler way to do this quickly. You can clear this if you don't want it to have a default post-use event. But we'll keep if we keep this as discard, you could change this to say something like exhaust instead. And now when we use this card, it will get exhausted instead and end up in our exhaust pile, not to be shuffled back into our draw pile. But let's keep this as discard, or maybe I'll put it as exhaust, why not? Yeah, and here you can change any starting statuses. This is more of an advanced topic, so I'll get into this in later videos, but here you can add any special components that are attached to the card itself and affects it in various ways. For instance, you have one card which has this component which keeps track of every time another card is used, the mana cost of this card is reduced and things like that. So you can do some advanced stuff with the starting statuses, but we'll leave that blank for this card. Then for the frame, you can choose the appearance of the card to a different type of frame. And we can also change the tint of the card. So these are things to have to do with appearance. You can play around with these if you want, but I'll cover changing the appearance of cards more in another video. So for data row, this you don't want to touch. This is just used during gameplay, so it has no effect if you change it here. Also, these other effects here, they are set during gameplay, so you don't need to change those, except for this one, which is again has to do with visuals. If you want the visual of the card to be represented with another kind of widget, this is where you would change it, but we will get into that in our card visual video. Unless you have repetitions, you can do this if you want the effect of the card to be repeated multiple times. So if we set the repetitions here to 1, that means that this card will repeat once, and that means that we will get strength, we will draw, we will get strength, and we will draw again. So you can have repeated cards in this way, but we'll set the repetitions to 0 for this one. So for the most part, gameplay wise, our card is now fully functional, but we still don't have a description for the card, and the tooltips are wrong. So let's change that. We can start by changing the tooltips. So we can keep this in the statuses tooltips, and we will find our strength tooltip. And since we have this as exhaust, then also let's add a exhaust tooltip as well. You can also find that in the statuses tooltips, and that should be exhaust there. So now if we now hit play, we have the strength and we have the exhaust tooltips. Okay, so all that remains now is the description. So let's start by just, writing exactly what we want it to say here, and then I'll get into how we can make it more dynamic afterwards. So this card, what we want to do is add 5 string and draw 2 cards, and then the card is exhausted. So if we try this, now we have a description. Add 5 strength, draw 2 cards, exhaust. What I tend to do with these cards, though, you can see that here that this is bolded out, the text that has a tooltip, and also the number is bolded out, and we don't get that here. Also, this is hard-coded. We want it might be that some other card modifies the strength or modifies the draw amount or something like that. So we want these numbers to change when the effect values change. So the way this is set up in the cards is that if we add a star and then a number, we can define which index of the effects array that we are finding the effect value of. So if I say 0 here, add *0 strength and draw *1 cards, then for *0 we are looking at the first card effect 0 here, and the effect value of 5. And for the other one, *1, we are looking at index 1 here, and which would be a value of 2. So if we now hit play, you can see that, yeah, we get the exact same numbers just in bold, but if these were to change in some way, then these would also change. Also, if you were to modify, the effect values of your cards, you don't have to go back to all of their descriptions and change the numbers to match. That will be done for you. And lastly, like I said, we want to pay attention or give attention to the player so that they notice the tooltip terms that we're using here, strength and exhaust. So we can put these in bold. So this is using Unreal Engine's rich text, where I've set up custom identifiers that you can use. So if you do, I can't even remember the name of this, but yeah, the pointy things like this with a T, and then another one with a slash at the end. Then you can do that for strength, and you can do the same thing here, T for tooltip, and then a slash at the end of this. And now if you hit play, you will see that these are in bold, and now it looks appropriate, akin to the other cards. So our card is actually done at this point. It looks good. We have a valid description. It works just the way we want it to. So those are the steps in how to create a card. So I know there's quite a lot, but the way I've set it up is to have it be extremely modular, so you can change out any of these sorts of effects, use costs, etc. So it's very powerful in allowing you to modify how this toolkit works to create your own very unique, very different functionality. So I will have other videos where I go more into depth into the various kinds of components that we're looking at here, but this should hopefully serve as a good starting point. So cards are at the heart of this toolkit, really. So a lot of the stuff that's going on is done by cards. So when the monster here uses its gain armor skill here, that is actually also a card that the monster is using. And even when you get a reward after you've done defeating a monster, that's actually a reward card that's being played. So when you know how cards work in this toolkit, you actually know most of how this toolkit works. And I know that some of this stuff can be difficult, and you need to get used to it. So I try to be quick and thorough in my responses in the support thread and on our Discord, which you can join if you have any sorts of questions or are trying to make a specific type of card and you are not able to. So just let me know over there, and I'll do my best to help. And I hope this has been informative and that you enjoy making cards. For adding these types of cards, when you get used to it, it's actually quite a lot of fun, and I hope this will be true for for other people making games as well. So good luck with that, and I'll see you in another video.